Hi, I'm Jim Goldberg, and it's great to welcome you here to the first of our 2 spring visitor lectures. On March 31st, Daniel Gordon will be here, and I know that he has work up at the pier that has attracted a lot of attention, and I suggest you all come to see him then. Tonight, we're lucky enough to have Laura Wexler, and I'll say a little more about her. But I won't even use it then. It's just that this is the part where I read. The Larry Sultan Visiting Artist Program is a collaboration between Pier 24 Photography, California College of the Arts, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And generous support from Pier 24 Photography, Randy and Bob Fisher, Robert Mailer Anderson and Nicola Miner, Nyan McAvoy, and the Black Dog Private Foundation. I mean, this lecture series, this visiting artist program was started in honor of Larry, who was a colleague and a friend and a teacher to some of us. And Larry had an inquisitiveness which was beyond words sometimes. He really never stopped looking and thinking about images and how they work. And I think it's too bad you never got to meet him, because I think you guys would be good friends. Laura's passion for understanding the meaning of history and the meaning of images and how we look at them is unsurpassed, I think, by anybody in the field right now. She teaches at Yale, and when I was a fellow there, I was lucky enough to be able to work with her. Jessica, someone sent me a list of all the things that Laura's done. It's very long. Laura founded and directs the Yale's Photographic Memory Workshop, designed to foster a collaborative discussion among students, faculty, staff, journalists, and artists on issues concerning photography and personal, social, and political memory. She's also affiliated with the university's film department and dealing with ethnicity, race, and migration, and its public humanities program. Most of the work that she's done in the past has been about race, gender, sexuality, and class in film and photography from the 19th century to the present day in the United States. And I know that Laura recently has become more and more involved in photography, to the point where she's starting to show work that she made when she was in college herself. And she's taught at Columbia, Amherst, Trinity, Wesleyan, and Peking. And I sat in one of her classes at Yale, and she was one of the finest teachers I've ever had the pleasure of watching. She also, just as an aside, if anyone doesn't know, she worked on the book The Notion of Family with Ruby Latoya Frazier, who was here a year or so ago. So Laura has an understanding that I'm sure she'll share with you tonight. So,
okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first I want to say thank you very, very much to the Larry Sultan Foundation for Visiting Artists for the opportunity to do this, to Jessica, who's taken such careful and good and smart care of me, to all the students that I met with yesterday who were awesome, and particularly to Jim. And I have to say, he came up with this idea that I should come here quite a long time ago. And I thought that was very nice. And but I was busy, and I was always busy, and he would say, well, what about this time? And I would say, no, I'm busy, no, I'm busy, no, I'm busy. And he kept asking, and finally it got through my dense head that he wasn't actually trying to get something from me. He was trying to give something to me, which was that I would come here and meet your community. And I want to say thank you, because that is exactly what has happened. I was, it's a long trip. It's been a terrible winter in the Northeast. These are my very few days of spring break. I have piles of stuff to do. I was very apprehensive, actually. Jessica had me scheduled for hour after hour of crits, and I thought, I can't do this. I mean, I'm gonna be so exhausted, and it's true. I am tired, but also I am so energized and so full and so excited about the conversations that I had, and it's a gift to me. So thank you. Jim, for your persistence and for the gift. Thank you. I thought I would. All right. So the last time I was in front of an audience that was art, primarily people working in the arts, was in Beijing in 2008 at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing, which is a major art academy in China. And not only was it my first time ever lecturing with simultaneous translation into Chinese, which is very disorienting. But it was my first time addressing a body of specifically artists in a sort of formal lecture. And I was talking about photography and history and memory, which is what I've been researching and working in for 25, 30 years now. And I explained current theories, academic theories of memory. Mainly, I was talking about the idea that memory is social, memory is communal, that if you don't have other people that you share your memories with, very soon you won't have your memories. That the individual memory depends on the group. And remember, I was talking about this to a group of sort of recently post-Cultural Revolution Chinese artists. And at the question and answer period, the hands went up and they said, well, excuse me, but that is not so. You are absolutely wrong. My memory is mine. And it has nothing to do with the community. Of course, this was translated between Mandarin and English, but no, they weren't having it at all. So here was the American talking about communal values, and here were the Maoists talking about individual memory, and that's my last experience talking to artists, artists. So I'm very interested to see what happens here. As I tell you about where I'm coming from, that's what I thought I would do as someone who's a historian, basically. I wouldn't even say that I'm an art critic. I'm really a historian, and I use photographs as my primary sources to understand where we're at and how we got there. And just as I have been learning how people are working here at CCA, Jim thought, and I thought it might be interesting to you to hear a little bit of my thoughts about how I work as a historian at Yale. So this is the photograph that resulted in the poster. It's a photograph that I took inside the National Police Archives in Guatemala City, Guatemala. This is a place some of you may have heard of that was discovered by accident. The dirty war in Guatemala, the genocide over many, many years of many, many thousands of people, was recorded in great detail by the Guatemalan police, and they kept the archives. Their sense of impunity was so strong, it didn't occur to them that they should get rid of the archives. They did dump them in a storehouse at the end of a vacant lot, at the end of an old car dump at the edge of the city. And they were discovered by accident. It's an incredible story. I won't go into the whole story. They were discovered by accident, and people have, for the past number of years, been restoring these documents. They were moldy. Even just the air in the place was dangerous. They were disgusting. You can see here the concrete wall that's between the two figures, and this is actually the place. This archive is the place where they tortured people. and they tortured them in little rooms, very bureaucratic little concrete rooms, just like that. And the staff has kept, it's an international staff, and they have kept the archives in this place. This is not one of the archives, one of the folders of the many thousands of folders of these people who were disappeared. What this is an album made by the Guatemalan police force at the turn of the last century. And it's a theme image for this talk because they're incredibly uncanny found documents in the manner or in the inspiration of Larry Sultan and his work on such kinds of ghostly matters. There are these books of these. These are, I think, vagrant women, hundreds and hundreds of them, as you can see. Who they are, what happened to them, who knows, but here are these books. And it's a kind of it will be a kind of background image for what I'm going to talk about today, because what interested me here, I couldn't believe it when they brought out these books to show us. And I said, well, who trained the police to make these books? How come the police at the turn of the last century were making these books? And they said, oh, well, the French police came and taught the French police came and taught us how to do this. So that means that the tradition of surveillance and police photography went from, its supposed start at the Paris Commune through the end of the century in France, and then went to a variety of colonial locations, including Guatemala. And I ask you to think of this image and then think of just these words, the French police, as I continue to go and talk about what is my method when I'm working with photographs. You know what you do when you're working with photographs. I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about what I do over the past 30 or more years. So just think about this album and the French police. I put 3 terms in the title for the talk: image, archive, and event. And I want to tell you a little bit about why I chose those 3. Image, maybe self-explanatory in a certain way. But I started as a photographer, not as a historian. And as Jim has made reference, I was at MIT as a student in 1968. Minor White was there. It was 1968, 69. Many things were happening. At MIT, there was a student takeover of the student center, and military personnel went AWOL and was protected by the students. That's the year of the Harvard strike. It's the year after. I think, and Tirza can probably, and Deirdre probably know this, classmates of mine from college. My college years only ended 1 out of the 4 years. All of the other 3 was political turmoil, and classes stopped early. I was at MIT that year, and I signed up for the basic course in photography that under Minor White's auspices. And it was when we had the assignment early on to take a 4x5 camera out into the streets of Boston and shoot film under a black hood, cloth, and come back with 3 finished prints in 24 hours. That something happened to me that has never gone away since. Partly it was to see the world upside down through that ground glass. But more it was that I knew at that instant, when I first set that up, that it was an extraordinary thing to make an image of a moment in the life of the world and make it permanent so that it can travel through time. I just knew that while it was interesting to make images, my business was on the other end of the camera, interpreting, thinking about what it means for there to have been an image of a moment made permanent and then distributed through time. And the wonder of that has never ended for me. And I say image because that's the foundation, was that moment. And also because I frankly don't believe that anybody should be writing about photography if they haven't tried to make photographs. I don't think the requirement is that they be wonderful photographs, but I do think before you start talking about what other people are trying to do, you should try it yourself because it's hard to do it. One of the things I've noticed here in talking with the students is this wonderful interdisciplinary transposition, the possibilities of working outside your major focus. I just think that's wonderful, and I wish more people got a chance to do it. And just because you take pictures doesn't mean you necessarily wind up as a photographer. Look what happened to me. I didn't have a career as a photographer, but I think the image is at the center of everything we're talking about. Now, about the image and its relationship to memory, this is a quote from John Berger. And this is probably the key to the way that I think about working with an image and in relation to history and memory. And Berger writes that most people use images in a very linear way. They use them most writers, most historians, use them to illustrate an argument or demonstrate a thought, which goes like this, from A to B. It goes in a unidirectional line. And frequently he says they also are tautological. Something is true because you can see that it's true. Here, you can see this, therefore this is true. And that's how and that's true even now, even after the visual turn in literary and historical criticism, it's true even now. Most people using photographs in academia use them in this way. Berger has another illustration, and this is as best as I could do it on a typewriter, but actually it's a radial. He says memory is not linear. It works radially, that is to say, with an enormous number of associations all leading to the same event. So if you want to put a photograph back into the context of experience, that is, so I said the thing that was stunning for me was to cut the image out and have it travel through time. But why that's important is because then it's a way to get back and figure out what made that image possible. And you have to respect, he says, the laws of memory, which are to situate the photograph in the center of this radius of kinds of memories: sensual memories, textual memories, audible memories, all kind. Memory is nothing simple or linear. There's never a single approach to something remembered. It's not, a memory is not the end point of a line. Something doesn't stop because something is remembered. It just goes on to more. Anyway, so this is Berger's idea, and it's been really central to my own practice. Okay, now archive. Well, wait a minute before we go. Okay, so the things I've done, maybe one of the most important things I did is about 20 years ago found a Yale Photographic Memory Workshop where I only have an awkward way of expressing why it's important. Jim said it more eloquently, but I noticed that the way I put it is people come with photographs attached. People come with photographs attached. And they need a place to talk about that. And there isn't any institutional place to talk about that. You need all the sources of that radial diagram to talk about that. And people to whom an image is attached want to talk about that. So the Photographic Memory Workshop has been an experimental workshop. It's named workshop deliberately in a bow to the various workshop movements over the past century or so. And we talk about these photographs that are attached to us. I have taught a cycle of 3 classes. One is called Photography and Images of the Social Body. It was all over the country. This class, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, a class like it was being taught all over the country under the name Photography and the Body. But Yale wouldn't let me put the body in the blue book. So I had to paint images of the social body. But anyway, it was that class. Then after 9/11, I started to teach a seminar on visuality and violence. And just before I went to Beijing in 2008, I started to teach the third in this triad, repeating triad, on photography, history, and memory. And out of all of this, I would say that I could distill one thing I have learned, and all of my students know this. I will say this, and I'll say it to you. What you want, and it's just about all I really know. The way that you want to work with a photograph is find a set, find a text, read the set against the text. Find a set, find a text, read the set against the text. That's it. That is the distillation of my method. It is deliberately loose. I'm not saying what kind of a text. I'm just saying there has to be one. And I'm not saying what size of a set. It means that there has to be more than one. Like you can have a set of one, I suppose, if you argue really strong. But you'll remember from set theory that the thing that's most interesting about a set is the line around it. Not necessarily what's in it, but what defines what's in it and what's outside of it. It's the line around the set that is most interesting. And so finding a set means also finding the line that's drawn around the set. And finding a text means allowing yourself to juxtapose a variety of things until something happens, until the text interacts or reacts with the set and the line. Okay, so that's what I know. So what does that mean in practice? Let me give you an example. A student a number of years ago, she is now a professor in a school in California, but she was a little freshman when she did this. Find a set, find a text. She was Hawaiian of Chinese, I think, family. She and her sister and her mother and her father lived in Hawaii. And growing up, what she remembered, her father was a doctor, and what she remembered was there was a lot of turmoil in the household. He was angry a lot. And anyway, over break, she had to find a set. So she went home to Hawaii, and in her father's study at home, there was, on the bookcase, there was a photograph that she'd never seen before. He loved pictures. There were pictures all over. Picture he had never seen before. She had never seen before, and she said, "Oh, who's that?" And he said, "Oh, that's my army buddy." He had been in the Vietnam War. "That's my army buddy." She said, "Well, do you have more?" And he had an album she had never seen. And so he let her take the album. And he had been a medic in Vietnam. So she had assumed that, she had differentiated him from a combat soldier. But what she did was to take this set, which was the album, and you can understand the line that's drawn around it. It's her father's album, and she can enrich that line. And she put it against a map of the major battles in Vietnam. And what she discovered is that the images of field hospitals and army buddies throughout the album corresponded very closely to the map of the worst battles, the bloodiest battles of the time that he was in Vietnam. Now, every war has its specific medical technology, advances in technology, and the huge advance in Vietnam, one of them were the helicopters that could bring desperately wounded soldiers back from the front line to the field hospital and have them live. In no other war before, those wounded would just have been left to die because it would have been hopeless. But the helicopters could bring these hopeless soldiers back to the field hospital, and in fact, in situation after situation on the map, with the photograph album documented that he'd been in some of the absolutely worst traumatic places of the war. So what she understood was that her father had a traumatic reaction, and that the turmoil and his inexplicable anger the whole time she was growing up had to do with PTSD, something no one had ever thought, she had never thought. When I recently saw her, I reminded her of this essay, and she actually burst into tears. That's what it means. Find a set, find a text, read the set against the text. And I never know. It's a deliberately vague assignment, but every student of mine can tell you about the assignment. I never know what's going to happen, but I know something is going to happen in every single class. The reason when I just taught, somebody found out that her grandfather was in secret a CIA agent. Her father didn't know it, the family didn't know it. She's now upended her whole plans, and he's got his papers in the Library of Congress. It's huge. I'm not going to talk more about it now. I don't know what will happen, but the assignment is crafted so that something will happen. Find a set, find a text, read the set against the text. Now, the set is also another way of saying it's an archive. And most recently, the language that's used in critical theory now is archive. So I accept that. And my historical research, my historical practice is about archives. That's fine. But what is an archive? What is an archive? The most common kind of used definition of an archive is of a kind of a treasure house. We now have, the 21st century has the ability to archive all these archives and put them online. We're all very concerned about what this storehouse concept means about the archive. But I want to tell you a story about the archive that changes maybe the way we normally we mostly think it's good to do this. But I want to remind you of a myth that you might not have thought about of being about the archive, but I would read it as that. It's the myth of the story of Odysseus and Polyphemus. You remember that in the Odyssey, Odysseus, on his way home, lands on the island of the Cyclops. He leaves his boat and he takes some of his men to go explore the island. And they find a cave, and the cave is full of all kinds of good things, plus food, and they're hungry. So they go in, they eat the food, and they look at all the good things, and then this sort of monster comes, and it's the Polyphemus, whose cave it is. And he is very angry to find them there. And he puts a boulder in front of the entrance of the cave so they can't get out, and he proceeds to eat 2 of them for dinner. So they have to figure out how to get out of there. And you remember that Odysseus and his men make a hot fight. Once they get him, Polyphemus, drunk and he falls asleep, they make a pointed hot stick, and they I forgot to say, he has only one eye. So they jam the stick into his eye and blind him. The Cyclops is enraged and in great pain. He says, "Who has blinded me?" Odysseus says, "My name is No Man." He's shrieking, "No man has blinded me." They are taunting him. "Well, what are you upset about then?" And this story goes on, and we root for the Odysseus and his crew, who manage to figure out how to hide themselves under the hairy sheep and get out the door when the Cyclops feels around the sheep but forgets to feel underneath the sheep to which the men are clinging. And the point of the story, as the Odyssey puts it, is the triumph of Odysseus over this monster. But I would like to suggest that it's Odysseus who's the intruder, and the cave is Polyphemus's treasure house. Everything precious that Polyphemus owns is in that cave, and Polyphemus has every right to defend his things. whoever draws the line around the set of things inside the treasure cave, it makes a difference who's drawing that line. Odysseus and his men think that inside that line, that's a line, that's a boundary they can cross. And Polyphemus thinks it's a boundary that he wants to protect. And this is a conundrum about the archive, because our current feeling is very much that we can just go into anybody's cave that's around and digitize and take out the stuff and put it where we want it. But I would like us to think about the Cyclops at the same time as we are so interested in everybody else's archives. I think the Smith is a really important one to think about in relationship to the archive. And it's that line that's drawn around, and who is it, as Derrida calls it, the archon, the person who draws the line around the archive, who says what goes in, who goes in, what comes out, who comes out. That is the key to the archive. So that's how I think about the archive. So find a set means you actually have to figure out what relationship you bear to the line around the set which produces the archive. Let me just give you some examples of some projects that what does this mean for me in practice. I just thought maybe I would tell you some of the things I've been doing over the past couple of years. So Jim mentioned Latoya Ruby Frazier's new book that's just out, her first monograph called A Notion of Family. She's a young African-American photographer. She's been photographing since she was in her teens. She's from Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is a steel town that has been completely abandoned by the steel companies. This town has been so willfully de-accessioned that the only restaurant in town was in the hospital cafeteria. Imagine that. if where you went to take somebody out to a nice dinner or for a business lunch was in the only place was the hospital cafeteria, and then they closed the hospital. And Latoya has been photographing for the past 10 years in this town, and her family in the town, who've been there since it was a thriving steel town with hope and promise and home ownership and public schools and restaurants and movie theaters and stores and everything you think should be in a town. And she has made this set of photographs. She has also fully adopted the American documentary tradition. She loves the American documentary tradition, and will thank, she will talk about the influence of everyone on her. But she does say in one video, she says about the FSA, she says she loves Dorothea Lange and Margaret Burke White, and she loves them all. But she does wonder what it would have been like if some of the people photographing the displaced and the poor for the FSA had actually wanted to be in the places they were photographing. And my head just exploded. When I first saw her show at the Brooklyn Museum, before she asked me to write the essay for her book, I was so excited I could not sleep that night. It was the same night that Wendy Brown was holding forth on the floor of the Texas Senate, so I remember this. I actually couldn't sleep because here was a new voice, a new text, vis-a-vis one of the key sets of photographs in American culture, the FSA OWI archive, with a new text. And that text for me was, I wonder what it would have been like if the people photographing for the FSA had really wanted to be where they were photographing. That's an example. I'm just telling you what I've been doing for the past 2 years. I wrote an essay about the Paris Commune, photography in the Paris Commune, dispelling the idea that the communards were so dumb they stood in front of the barricades and let the police take their pictures and then the police arrested them and killed them one by one because they could identify them from the pictures. That's the story that Giselle Freund and other people say. Police surveillance photography started there, but actually, if you go to the whole set, there are hundreds of photographs of the communards, and while there are a few that are close enough up to the barricades for the people to be identified, and that certainly did happen, there are many hundreds in which it would have been impossible to identify them. So that is a story we have to start also to retell. I've written the essay for a book about to come out on Roman Vishniak. Again, somebody whose archive we only know a very small piece of, and Maya Benton, a young curator, spent the past 10 years. She finally got access to that archive, and we find that most of what we know and much of what Roman Vishniak said about himself is not true. We have accepted the photographs that he took of the doomed villages in the shtetl of the Polish Jews as a vanished world, people who are about to, the irony is they're about to be killed, but they don't know it. In fact, he was commissioned by the Joint Distribution Committee of the Jewish charities who were trying to show that these people were very strong and able to adapt, and people should send money. It wasn't that they were doomed. It's exactly the opposite. And after World War II, when Vishniak came to the United States, the only story Americans would listen to were that those were pictures of people, not resilient people, about to be relentlessly and mercilessly killed. I just wrote an essay about Roland Barthes and his mother, his famous mother who's invisible, arguing that the reason that he makes his mother invisible in camera lucida is because actually there's an optical illusion called the Wexler effect. If you look very steadily at a dot and you don't move your eyes, you stare at the dot, everything around the dot will eventually disappear. Your eye has to move or it can't see, and by staring at the single dot, you become blind to what is around it. You can Google it and try it. It's really fun. People forget that in the missing image, the Winter Garden photograph, there are two children, Bart's mother and her brother. And although Bart's mother's maiden name is Bart, her married name is Bart, her married name is Berger, which is also the name of her brother. And the father, so that's Bart's grandfather, was the colonial governor of Ivory Coast. And was a French explorer and imperialist, proudly. And in order to, Bart keeps us intensely involved in staring at the mother who we're not allowed to see. I'm arguing precisely to make invisible the brother and the patronym and the thread into the past and the colonial past and the imperial past in his own family that would lead us to. There you can see that you know what the image is, and the text is her maiden name, Berger. You can look him up. It's interesting. I'm writing a story about. I'm writing a paper about Keiji Nakazawa, who was a 6-year-old at Ground Zero in Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped. Survived the bomb. Grew up to become a graphic designer. He made a career in making manga, Japanese manga comics, and his mother also survived, and she died very young, and Keiji Nakazawa had her cremated, and when he got the ashes back, apparently if you're cremated in this traditional Japanese way, the fire is not hot enough to destroy all the shards of bone. You get an urn of ashes back with bone in it. You're supposed to. That's what happens. But none of her bone was in these ashes. And he became furious at that point. It's about 20 years after the bomb. He became furious because the radioactive disease that happened because of her exposure had eaten away at her bone so much that it wasn't strong enough to, it wasn't there. He became furious, and he said, they took even my mother's bones. And at that point, he started to write a graphic memoir called I Saw It, Barefoot Gang. It's a 10-volume graphic memoir of that experience and the years after in Japan. And the suitcase of atomic bomb survey photographs that was found on the top of a pile of garbage in Watertown, Massachusetts a few years ago are images. So the United States Army sent survey teams in a very few days after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and their idea was, the U.S. knew the minute the bomb was dropped, people knew, well, what we did to them, they can do to us. And so there's an immense, immediate demand to rethink civil engineering. What kind of concrete, what kind of steel, what kind of shelter, what distance from ground zero? We needed to know which is the best kind of concrete, where is the radius of survival, what will happen in concentric circles out from the point of impact. And they photographed all of this, but they photographed it without caring about the people, the survivors who were also there. And Keiji Nakazawa is drawing, basically using the photographs and drawing the people with his hand back in as an attempt to reverse the gaze of the perpetrator that erases the survivors like him of Hiroshima. So, and I, in all of this, I think you can hear what I mean by find a set, find a text, read the set against the text. Now, this is a project I'm involved in right now. The latest name of it is Ordinary Intimations. When I went to China in 2008, and I taught, I think, the first course on history, photography, and memory that was taught, certainly in Beijing. It was so important to people that I was on the radio and in the newspaper. I was interested in people sharing their family photographs, and I was told, oh, the students won't do that because they won't share their private realities. And besides which, there aren't any pictures. I was interested in photographs from the Cultural Revolution generation, and the generation in school now is their children. And I was told you can't teach that course. But everything I was told about China before I went was wrong. And the class was eager to share their photographs, and they had hundreds of photographs. And not only that, when they wrote home, their parents sent photographs or sent scans of the photographs. And I walked into that classroom. I thought I was just going to sort of have fun in China. I would do Tai Chi and eat fabulous food. 3 weeks in, I walked into the classroom, and there was a pile of 15 handmade photograph albums on my desk that had essays attached to them about the two generations. And the fact that the generation that went through the Cultural Revolution has not told the current generation what happened. They just, China's changed, and the desperate violence and poverty that generation lived through is, well, I don't want to say it's gone, but it's not the same construction now. And they just want their children to walk through the door of the future, please, and thrive, and don't look back. But the children want to know, and this conversation hasn't happened. So I started collecting family albums from China, and I've gone back 6 times. I'm buying orphan albums in the markets. The Penjiayuan market in the middle of Beijing, a huge market, has these orphan albums. So do the rural, they're all over. It's bad that they're orphaned because you don't have the stories attached to them, but there are hundreds of albums. This is in fact this is more unusual. I went with a colleague to the village that she grew up in, which is a very impoverished rural village outside of Wuhan. People came running out of their houses to show us their pictures. And here's an example. And this man worked for the university, and he's showing us, he's telling stories. Guigui is with me, so she's interpreting. I didn't learn Mandarin. He's telling us the stories about the strike at his university during Tiananmen Square. And he's telling us how he served food to the students. He served food, which was dangerous for him to do. And he's remembered this and he's saying it. And the photographs, my saying, tell me about this photograph, is providing a way for stories to be told that are not being transmitted. They can't be published in China, but they are an opportunity for people to tell these stories. The text I'm finding here is the text of the people themselves when they're talking to me about the photographs. Driving to this village, we picked up an auntie of Guigui's in Wuhan and drove her out to the village, and Guigui was telling her what I was there for, and she said on the way out of the car, she said, I was part of the group of people that we threw the teacher off the roof of the school. And I thought about it a lot, and I don't really know whether that was right or wrong. I think it was wrong. And then she left. There isn't a Truth and Justice Commission. There isn't a place for these stories. There isn't a way to tell the stories. People don't know what to think, but they certainly remember, and they certainly have photographs. So here's some more examples. Oh yeah. And when I say album, I mean this man, that's a different man, but that's a piece of old newspaper in which is a bunch of family snapshots from the sent out era that were just, that counts as an album. Here's some more of them. I won't talk more and more about it. The middle is a school teacher. He was too poor. He was Guigui's teacher. He was too poor to have a camera, as many Chinese were, most Chinese were. But every year at school, there were school pictures. And one of his students one year paid for the school photographer to take a picture of him. So there he is as a young man at his desk. That's in the middle. And there he is with my visiting him in his home, holding up that picture of him as a young man. What's really amazing about him is he has albums of every single year that he taught in the village school. He knows that these photographs are important, and even though he couldn't make his own, he has them. So in that sense, finding a text can be very difficult, but it's a great adventure. So I want to end this. I want to just say, I want to talk a little bit about one further question. Ariella Azoulay has recently written about the political horizon of the photograph, and she believes there's something what she calls a civil contract, that we agree that there's a request that people are making to be seen, and we understand the language of that request and we respond to that request. There is a society of the photograph. We have learned. In fact, she says, what is a photograph? It actually isn't the thing. It isn't the thing. It's an occasion. The photograph can happen even when there is no photograph, because the civil relations can happen even when there is no photograph taken. A photograph is a civil relation between people that since the 19th century has been established such that we all understand its language and use it in different ways. So this is Avedon's photograph of William Caseby, born a slave. And it's a photograph that Roland Barthes uses, again, Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida. And I think that a lot of our theory of photography is umbilically related to Barthes and Barthes' theories. He calls this a perfect image of the mask of slavery. And it helps if you begin to understand the imperial colonial background of his mother's family. to understand the complexity of what he's saying here. But that's what he says. This is the perfect mask of slavery. And as you know, Roland Barthes likens photography to death. He says the important thing about a photograph is that was here, and what is photographed was there, and it is there no longer. He was alive, and now he's dead. He says this repeatedly throughout the book. There's somebody else who we should know about, and that's Frederick Douglass. Douglass, it turns out, was also very interested in photography. In fact, he gave several public lectures, including one at the very beginning of the Civil War, right after Lincoln's first inaugural address. Douglass was born a slave, as we know. He became a great orator for abolition, he gives this talk at Tremont Temple in Boston about photography. He's probably one of the most significant theorists of photography we have. He's probably the only, or maybe anyway, probably one of very few people who had been a slave who was also a theorist of photography. And he lived out a very different relationship between slavery, photography, and the law than what Roland Barthes, or what by extension much of the Barthian built ideas about photography would have us believe. Maybe Sojourner Truth is a companion of his. In fact, he refers to her photographs. For Douglass, he famously wrote an essay called The Negro as Man, and he castigated the way that African Americans were generally portrayed in the illustrated press. Photographs could correct such distortions, he thought, by producing an actual likeness rather than a caricature. The accessibility of the medium by mid-century meant that African Americans themselves could for the first time have true images of themselves, escaping the harm of being viciously unseen by others. He wrote, "A very pleasing feature of our pictorial relations is the very easy terms upon which all may enjoy them. The servant girl can now see a likeness of herself such as noble ladies and even royalty itself could not purchase 50 years ago. Formerly the luxury of a likeness was the exclusive privilege of the rich and great, but now, like education and 1,000 other blessings," you see the autodidact here and the man of progress in the 19th century. He loved trains, he loved electricity, he loved all the mark of progress. He thought this would bring the world together, and he loved photography. We are in an advancing march of civilization. Such pictures are placed within easy reach of the humblest members of society. Photography also meant that cheap and accurate images of African Americans could be widely circulated, rapidly eradicating the distorted image that kept President Abraham Lincoln initially from allowing black men to serve in the armed forces at the start of the Civil War, even at the risk of losing the war. Douglass was furious at Lincoln for not arming black men, and he wrote, this is Douglass, "While I do not charge, as some have, that the government is conducting the war on peace principles, it is plain that they are not conducting it on war principles. We are fighting the rebels with only one hand when we ought to be fighting them with both. We are recruiting our troops at the north when we ought to be recruiting them at the south. We are striking with our white hand while our black one is chained behind us. We are catching slaves instead of arming them. We are repelling our natural friends to win the friendship of our natural enemies. We are endeavoring to heal over the rotten cancer instead of cutting out its death-dealing roots and fibers. We seem a little more concerned for the safety of slavery than for the safety of the Republic." And finally, and these are pictures of Douglass without the mask of slavery, maybe. And finally, and you see that throughout his life, he was dedicated to getting images of himself made. And in fact, he's really thought through this pose, and it goes throughout his entire life. he's presenting himself to the camera in a particular way. And Douglass says, and finally, when the war was drawing to its close at last, and President Lincoln gave a second inaugural address, and Lincoln knew that the war was just about over. He knew that the North had won, but it wasn't literally over. It's never over till it's over, so he wouldn't say so. And his second inaugural address is one of his greatest speeches. It's very, very brief, and it's very clear how exhausted the country was and how exhausted he was. He says, we don't know why it cost us so much blood and treasure. It's not ours to know why. We can only to do the right as God gives us to see the right. And a few weeks later, he would be dead. The toll of 4 years of furious bloodletting was very apparent. And Douglass had forgiven Lincoln for the prosecution of the war in the beginning. Lincoln did arm black men. Douglass was in charge of recruiting black troops. He offers, again, photography as a solution for the country. He says that thoughts that rise from the horrors of the battlefield, like the gloomy exhalations from the dampness and death of the grave, are depressing to the spirit and they impair the health. 1 hour's relief from the intense, repressive, and heart-aching attention to the issues involved in the war may be of service to all. Poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, and this ability is the secret of their power and of their achievements. They see what ought to be by the reflections of what is, and endeavor to remove the contradiction. At the brink of catastrophe, Frederick Douglass used photographic portraits to manifest his own personhood before the law in 1863, similar to the way that Martin Luther King used the I Am a Man photographs in 1968. And once again, at the end of the war, he used the idea of photography as that which would save now the exhausted spirit of the country and project a meaning into the future that was as vital as the war itself. That's Douglass's text placed against the set of Douglass's photographs, and I do think that without such photographs, perhaps our social contract might long since have been fully broken. So that's what I do. I want to show you one more project. How, Jessica? Okay, minimize window. Okay, thank you. All right. Finally, I want to tell you about something else. This is the Photogrammer project that we are supported by a startup grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities, and for the past 4 or 5 years, a multidisciplinary team that consists of, consists of me, my graduate student Lauren Tilton, who had a background in museum work before she came to graduate school, Taylor Arnold, who is a statistics genius, who was in graduate school, is now graduated and working for AT&T, was very, very interested in what statistics people call a messy data set, and the 170,000 photographs of the FSA-OWI archive are definitely that. Stacy Maples, the map ninja at the GIS mapping specialist at Yale, has since just moved to Stanford. We just lost him a few months ago. Peter Leonard, the first and as yet only digital humanities librarian for research at Yale, and Ken Pankow, the academic technologist. We've been working together for 5 years to produce the Photogrammer map of all of the, it's about 190,000 actually, photographs of the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information that were, you know about this set or file. It's owned by the citizens of the United States, so we don't have to pay. We kind of threaded the needle with this project because we don't have to pay. We could not do that, and the Library of Congress had also beautifully digitized several different times of several different lifespans of technology, these images. We have correlated every single image to the county where it was made. We also have another map in which every single photographer, so say Russell Lee or Jack Delano or Jean Vachon, is a different colored dot, and you can see their journey across the country, and you can click randomly on a dot, and you can see Jack Delano in Fort Madison. You can see every photograph that was taken there. You can go further into the metadata and see all the metadata that the Library of Congress also collected. So Paul Vanderbilt created originally the finding aid for the FSA OWI collection, and it was a very idiosyncratic. Vanderbilt, the genius, thought it was one of the best achievements of his life. To us, it seems very odd because their photographs are arranged by category, and the categories are things like men with hats, tobacco barns, old men, and so if you're trying to do serious research in this archive, you actually really can't. And so we have preserved the Vanderbilt categories, and I'll show you a chart of that, but we've also distributed them geographically and connected them to the metadata. One of the interesting things, we just have launched, we've done an informal launch of this. Our official launch is coming up pretty soon. One of the things I've noticed, we had Lauren and I spoke on NPR radio about this, you can look it up, but one of the things that I find is that people go immediately to where they are or where they were born. And so where we were looking at this before, is that's Marin. Where are we? Here, found it. Okay. And this is Dorothea Lange in June of 1913. These are all the photographs that she took. Here's the Mission District, with all of its metadata and all optically identifiable similar photographs. So it's a nimble and easy and fun, and they're one of the things that's sort of stunning to me is how beautiful they are. The immediate research result is what? Can you guess? I won't make you guess. The fame of this archive is that it's about Appalachia. It's about the Dust Bowl. It's about the poor Southern tenant farmers who were being imaged as the deserving poor so that Roosevelt's agencies, resettlement agencies, could be funded in order to resettle them. And the Tea Party for the time was furious at Roosevelt and was trying to attack the New Deal programs. And so this is the propaganda wing of the Roosevelt administration. But what's immediately apparent is it's not only about Appalachia and the Dust Bowl. Immediately, boom, open your eyes, here's a map. They're all over the place. Okay, so that's one immediate result. I want to share another with you. Let's see. And I'll leave you with this. Our experience with strips. So we were at the Library of Congress, Taylor and Lauren and I, and we were talking with Beverly Brannon, who's been the longtime curator of this archive, and Taylor, who's the numbers genius, is sitting at the corner of the table, and he's looking at the metadata, and every single photograph has this little number that says N, and this and that. And Taylor finally pipes up and says, "What does N mean?" And Beverly says, "I don't know. We don't know. It was in the metadata, so we preserved it." That is a fine librarian. It was there, so we copied it, but we don't have any idea of what it is. That's what we knew. So Taylor went back and he had the numbers. That's what he had. He's a statistics student. He's very suspicious of the humanities, actually. And he's looking at all these numbers, and he's looking at, and he figures out there's this regularity in these N numbers. To make a long story short, the FSA photographers had industrial film. They were sent out into the field with long rolls of film, so not 24 or 36 exposures. They had to, by law, send the rolls of exposed film back to the wet lab in Washington to be developed and printed. They were being developed and printed by people that Stryker found on the street, basically. They were not necessarily fine printers. They were learning on the job. They took these long rolls of film and they cut them into strips. And when Stryker and the others decided which of the frames that they would keep, they made holes in some of the other ones, or they just threw them into a tangle. Okay, so there's these strips. So what Taylor figured out is the N meant the negative number, the number of the frame. And this meant that we could reattach these strips to get basically a film of the shooting of the assignment. I don't know if I can find this right now, if it's here. Yeah. So here's Jean Vachon in July of 1941 in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And he's photographing cheese. Cheese, Wisconsin cheese, cheddar cheese, I guess, cheese. Then in the middle, right before the red, it says stop cheese. He's had enough of cheese. I don't want any more cheese. And the next frame in the strip that we were able to put together, and it has a lot of algorithms and other math attached to doing this, is in Chicago. And it's a man who's down in his luck. Sorry if this is too, yeah, it's this. This is, well, yeah, these are the first, this is the strip below the first pictures. And so he moves from Wisconsin and the production of cheese to Chicago and the man who's, out of work. And you can see something about the thought process. You can follow him. You can see that, and I think that probably it has to do with our country is still productive. We are still making cheese. We are an inexplicably messed up place because we can't get the products we make to enrich or support the lives of the citizens who support the government and make the products. It's that kind of liberal argument. We can fix this. We can get cheese, we can market the cheese, and we can distribute the wealth to Chicago. This doesn't need to happen. Remember, it's an argument for the New Deal. And we can put together the thought process of the photographers that Stryker sent out across the country. So that I'm not going to talk even more. I've been talking for a long time. So find a set. In that case, is the set of 100 and roughly 70,000 photographs of the OWA archive. But the text is... for me right now is a group of us were giving a talk at one of the big association meetings, and I'll never forget this. We were walking across a lobby of a hotel in Chicago, and Taylor pipes up, by the way, what is a strip? He's a born digital native. He has never seen film. He had no idea what it was. He was like, then you hang it up, and the strip, and that. Oh, he simply did this because he was interested in the number after the letter N. Okay, thank you. It's all public, photogrammer.yale.edu. You could go to it. It's launched, it's out there. Sometimes it isn't working because we're still working on it. And we're having a party in about 3 weeks to launch it, and another student of mine, find a set, find a text, read the set against the text. For that assignment, went into the archive before we had done Photogrammer and found a photograph of her own great-grandmother, her own great-aunt, Geneva, who she had never met, who there are family stories about. She's a dancer. A lot of dancers don't go directly to college. If they're very successful dancers in New York, they don't want to give up that part of their life to school. They dance, and when they're slightly older, many come to Yale. She took this course. She found this photograph. I commissioned a dance. And she has now made a dance called the Geneva Project that dances. I've always wanted somebody to dance inside photographs. I think that anyway, so she's made a dance of what it means to her to have found this photograph. She's danced this photograph, not the way I imagined when I commissioned it, but it's her dance. And one of the great things I think about Photogrammer is that it's going to open up this archive to new kinds of artists and new kinds of expression and new kinds of public meaning for this incredibly valuable project that was done during the Depression. Okay.